So good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Security Day on countering fragmentation and polarization and recreate a climate for stability in Europe. Traditionally, we begin with a night owl session to kick off the discussion. We'll continue today the whole day. And I would like at the outset to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic for hosting this opening reception, the co-organizing and co-sponsoring the Security Day event. I felt, even though we are running late on the schedule, but still I felt that we need to be dragged away from the very nice buffet and the garden and the weather, and to start working. And I think this is also in recognition of your great hospitality. I would like also to thank the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for co-organizing and co-sponsoring this event. May I remind you of some of the key features of our Security Days. First of all, the informality. The agenda of the Security Day is not an agreed agenda, but it's something that we set as how can I say, an indication, a path of discussion. The speakers are here speaking not on record, but then this is not a Chatham House event either, because the event is live streamed on the website, and I would like to encourage your participation also through social media. Hashtag is hashtag SecDays on Twitter. Those following the event online should feel free to post comments and questions via Twitter and Facebook, and we will bounce them back to the moderators and the speakers. So this evening, just a few words on the Night Owl session. We have seen political debates in many OSCE countries, including long-standing democracies, that are nowadays increasingly framed by appeals to emotions disconnected from real facts, and many populists across Europe try to exploit grievances and insecurities of the electorate by twisting the facts or simply not saying the truth. While this is not an entirely new phenomenon in politics, unfortunately, but the spread of disinformation and myths in the digital era has reached an unprecedented pace and scale, with the potential to significantly influence public opinion and political decision-making. So this session will discuss security implications of the phenomenon of post-truth politics for international security and stability. It will explore how the resilience of societies to resist and counter disinformation and myths can be strengthened, what role the media should play in these efforts, and how governments and state institutions should respond to this challenge. But let me leave it at this. It will be for the moderator and the panelists to continue. From my side, I would like to thank you again and wish fruitful and productive discussions to all of us. And I'm pleased and honored to pass the floor now to the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic for Security and Multilateral Issues, Mr. Ivo Šrámek. Minister.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Secretary General, Mr. Chairman, it's my great pleasure to welcome you today in Prague to the OSCE Security Days that will focus on the challenges of the common security. The Czech government and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are all glad to be able to provide host support to the event, which has become traditional. The Security Day, with its well-thought-through agenda, are part of our effort to re-establish dialogue on common security challenges, given the array of new threats from terrorism to cyber defense, to cyber attacks, and after Crimea and Donbass as well, we cannot pretend business as usual. We need to name our problems and agree on the ways of overcoming divisions. The The structured dialogue is the main avenue for such debate, and the security days are a useful contribution to it. And I would like to appreciate the personal and dedicated role of our Secretary General, Lamberto Zannier, to these efforts. This opening night session will tackle one of the most interesting but also the most difficult issues, disinformation. Mr. Secretary General already spoke about it. We think that we can hear a lot of speaking about resilience. It is being talked by everybody, but we also shouldn't fall into the trap of fighting fire with fire, propaganda with counter-propaganda, and that is the world we would wish to leave behind us. And we hope that the dialogue we will have here in Prague, in Vienna, and elsewhere in the OSCE will help ensure that we will not end up in resurgence of Cold War in any of its forms, and it must not be the spirit of 1984 which will prevail, but the spirit of 1972, that of the Helsinki Final Act, and all other rules on which the order of our Euro-Atlantic space is based. I wish you all to have a good debate at the opening night session, and I hope that this palace, especially this hall, which witnessed the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact in 1991, will contribute to the positive spirit of this session. Thank you very much.
Try to please these, to put these people boy, girl, you know. Good evening to you all, very warm welcome. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored and pleased to be here. My name is Matthijs Berman, Principal Advisor of the Representative on Freedom of the Media, if only we had one at this very moment. And I hope we will get this appointment as soon as possible, because the OSCE needs a representative on freedom of the media, as we all know. Fake news and security. Propaganda and disinformation are of all times. Nothing new under the sun, you would say. And their potential disruptive power is nothing new either. We don't really need disinformation to do what we have to do good. Honesty and goodwill do not need lies. To help others, you just do what you have to do. The truth is enough. But when it comes to leading the population to the worst, leaders always rely on propaganda and lies. This is a hypothesis. Perhaps we need a fact check. Propaganda and disinformation were the discourse towards massacres and wars in our history in order to prepare the population for major atrocities, for grave breaches of human rights. Genocides have been prepared by propaganda, where victims have been systematically dehumanized. And you can only do that with disinformation. And perhaps this is ultimately what is so distressing about disinformation and fake news. That leads to violence and to war. Even in times of peace, fake news is a useful tool for many groups who seek to convince where they don't succeed with factual information, with arguments, and above all, with a vision of the future. What is perhaps new today, as the Secretary General rightly pointed out, is the speed and scale with which fake news can spread today thanks to internet. What is also new is the targeted way fake news and propaganda can reach people individually, very precisely via social media, and unfiltered, unchecked by professional, trustworthy journalists. Fake news and propaganda had some impact on the presidential elections in the USA, to be seen how much. Certainly, there has been fake news used in the Brexit referendum campaign. It is, fake news, a weapon of mass deception. The representative on freedom of the media, just before she left, Dunya gathered her colleague mandate holders in Vienna, and they issued a joint declaration. The UN mandate holder, Organization of American States, the African Commission on Human Rights, and Dunya Mijatovic, representative on freedom of the media of the OSCE, they presented a joint declaration on fake news and disinformation as a guide of recommendations to governments how to deal with this. First of all, no censorship. Media literacy, professional journalism. But then again, you don't get rid of it that easily. To speak about this issue of security and post-truth politics, we're very lucky to have a distinguished panel here. 4 guest speakers of very different origins. Ivan Krastev, where are you? Here. Chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, expert in foreign relations and geopolitics. Mathilde Damgé, over there, journalist at Le Monde in Paris, member of the fact-checking team that has been launched in 2014. Jakub Kalenský, member of the East StratCom task force at the External Action Service in Brussels, European External Action Service, of course. And then we have Diana Rusu, foreign affairs journalist in Bucharest. Each of these 4 panelists will hold a short introduction, 5-10 minutes maybe. There will be questions by you. There will be people running around here with microphones to give you the floor if need be. And I hope this will be a lively thing that depends also on you. So please raise your hands whenever you think I need to say something now or to ask a question. Yeah? And I prefer questions to declarations. Okay, let's start with Diana Rusu. Diana, you are from Romania, and you are specialized in EU affairs, NATO. Your work motto is a quote from the Israeli author Amos Oz. It says, "A conflict begins and ends in the hearts and minds of people, not on the battlefield." What made you choose that as a motto for your journalistic career?
I chose it, I think everybody hears me. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For me, it's a great honor to be here. I'm the youngest member of the panel, but this is not important. I am happy to be here with the distinguished colleagues of mine. I chose this in the beginning of my career, which was 5 years ago. It seems like a lifetime for me. Because this Amos Oz, this Israeli author, influenced me into believing that the fanatic world has to be tackled in any way possible, and that moderation and stability and compromise are very important in any domain and for everybody, and so we could have a better society.
Let me just give you the floor for 5-10 minutes. Hold your speech, and we'll continue after that. Is that okay?
Sure.
Please.
So, I was introduced. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. It's my first time in front of such a distinguished audience. What I would like to address is the Deputy Minister's call to action earlier, to address the facts, to address the reality in which we live in. And in 2013, I started reading reports on cybersecurity and on cyber war. And what I've noticed then, but I was really young and inexperienced, was that there was an influence, a great deal of a military and strategic approach to this cyber war. But very few spoke about the communication, the cyber communication importance aspect. And we are here in 2017, after 2016, which was a year that has revolutionized everything in terms of cyber communication and politics. And we see that only the ones who did understand how important it is to address this niche, this segment, the cyber communication, the social media, and blogs, websites, and everything that's online and it's spreading fast, communication that's spreading fast. The ones that did this, regardless of their interest, were the ones that right now hold an asset, an advantage, if I might say so, and while the other ones, and I have to be critical of the European Union leaders, of some of them at least, to not understanding what the great deal of this development. We were talking about fake news in terms of high leadership only in December 2016, after we had countless examples, and I will not mention the US election. Each one of you, I'm sure, has an example in their own country of fake news influencing people and spreading extremely fast in communication. And how is this possible? It was possible because, from what I've noticed, there was also a very important psychological aspect. And I identified 3 pillars of the way I did a little research, which I did not publish, just for myself to understand it better, on how Russian Kremlin propaganda influenced the US, the Western EU, and the eastern part of Europe. Because I noticed that there were different patterns. It was not the same message sent to everybody, like the others are doing. Peace is great, stability is great. No, there were different, very smart, different messages. And for example, for the Eastern Europe, even for the countries in the European Union, there was an approach, there was a religious approach on the orthodoxy, which is a part of Christianity, and the call to action to protect family values. You know the narrative, it's pretty common. On the Eastern Europe, Western Europe, western side of the EU, I noticed that there was, the ego was in the center. The former great empires like the United Kingdom or France had fake news. I mean, the people had fake news involving the greatness of the country, the long days of when the language or the culture or the country was important. And each of you can check this. And you have seen it in Marine Le Pen's narrative thousands of times. Let's become a country, and also in Donald Trump's. This was a narrative used also in the US, but on another level, on an economic level, the superpower, the economic superpower. I don't want to take the floor too much because I'm sure you have questions, and I'm sure my colleagues want to say many things, but let me end this by saying that this is, from my point of view, the latest hour in which, the 11th hour in which we can address this issue and wake up and see this is a real problem that, as my colleague Mr. Berman said, will end up in tensions, in violence, and why not will end up maybe in desperate measures taken by authorities that will lead to censorship and who knows what else. Thank you very much.
Very good. Diana, we will come back to you on many things, but in particular also what you think about the role of younger journalists who are born with a smartphone in their hand. and who are perhaps much more social media savvy than others in countering disinformation.
I'm part of this, so...
Yeah, indeed, you're part of it. So from your own first-hand experience, you can tell us this. Let me turn to Jakub Kalenský, because you already had, Diana started. Jakub, at the StratCom task force, countering fake news, with a very small team, and meager means, and a lot of work. What was the initial urgency why this StratCom task force has been set up, please?
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having me here. And let me also say that the Deputy Minister, when he talked about fighting disinformation, it was not just a declaration. Actually, this ministry has sent me to Brussels and is paying my wages there, so they are actually doing something in this regard as well. Well, you would need to ask actually 28 leaders of the European nations what was the urgency. Our team was formed following the March 2015 Council conclusions. So the leaders of the states basically agreed that European Union should counter what was called the ongoing Russian disinformation campaign. We changed the wording a little bit. We do not talk about Russian disinformation campaign, we talk about pro-Kremlin disinformation campaign. We have two reasons for that. We see the same messages that you see in Russian state media being spread also in other European languages. Not only that Russia today is operating in something like 100 countries and Sputnik has over 30 language mutations, you also see the very same messagings being spread by various outlets that pretend to be the only independent alternative to the lying mainstream, but they basically just copy-paste what we see from the Russian disinformation machine. So that's one reason why we talk about pro-Kremlin and not Russian. That's the language reason. The other reason also is that we do not want to identify this disinformation machine with the Russian nation, with the Russian people. That would be totally unfair. Russia is not only Dmitry Kiselyov and Vladimir Solovyov. Russia is also the brave journalists from Novaya Gazeta, from the TV Dozhd, various very brave regional journalists. So it would be simply unfair to them to talk about Russian disinformation campaign. It's a pro-Kremlin disinformation campaign. So how do we counter it? The action plan that was also approved by all the member states gives us three objectives. The first of them should be better communicating of the EU policies in the Eastern Partnership countries. Now, this may sound like just another extension of the press department, but the thinking behind this is here that if we manage to explain the Georgians or the Moldovans what the EU is about, they could stop buying the stories from Sputnik Georgia, which actually tell them EU will turn you into gays and pedophiles. So we have to explain them a bit better what the EU is about. The second objective is supporting the independent media in the region. We are again talking about the Eastern Partnership countries, and I believe the thinking here is quite clear. Better media means better informed society, means better decision making. The third objective, which probably gets the most attention and which I am leading on, and that's probably why I'm here, is actually responding to the disinformation campaign. As you mentioned, the team is actually not very big. We are 11 people. We might be growing to 13 or 14 in the next couple of weeks or month. And majority of the team actually works in the first two objectives. So for this, we have currently 2 people. Maybe we will be 3 in a couple of weeks. We have a product, a regular weekly product called Disinformation Review. The decision was that we actually thought that when we started our mandate in September 2015, the expert knowledge was already quite high, thanks to works by people like Edward Lucas, Peter Pomerantsev, or the great Ukrainian experts who are actually doing a tremendous job. Researchers in the Baltic states, Finnish guys like Pasi Eronen or Saara Jantunen. The expert knowledge was already quite high. The trouble with expert knowledge is it's only among the experts. So we didn't want to raise the expert knowledge, we wanted to broaden the audience, which means we had to make the products very simple, trying to be a bit entertaining on our Twitter account. And yeah, we simply pick and collect the latest disinformation examples to simply expose what is actually happening currently in the sphere of disinformation. The aim of the product is multiple. It's not only to actually collect and expose the disinformation so that we actually collect finally some data. It's also, we see that it works quite well as an early alert system, that if we manage to expose the disinformation that is spread only by an outlet, let's say in the separatist republics in the east of Ukraine, we know that we can warn some other audiences that a similar disinformation is coming to your countries. And we saw it many times that the disinformation, one and the same piece, travels via dozens of languages and tries to target dozens of millions of people. So maybe let me stop here and we can leave the rest for the Q&A session.
Now just, what is the audience you are targeting?
Given the quite small resources for this activity, we know that we cannot reach everyone from Givi Gizitashvili in Georgia to Ian Smith in Wales, so that's not our ambition. We know that we are mostly read by government officials, various ministries. We know that even some secret services are using this product because it gives them the open source intelligence they maybe are not able to gather. We know that many journalists and researchers actually use it. This is probably what we are most happy for when we see that the product is used for further reporting, reaching further audiences. So you could say it's something between the expert audience and between the general public. It's the semi-expert audience.
If I may, what surprises me a little is that you particularly address disinformation, propaganda from what you rightly call pro-Kremlin sources, to keep it a bit large, broad definition. You do not address disinformation coming from, let's say, European countries, Western European countries, on the European Union. There is quite a bit of disinformation on the European Union and its functioning, and for instance in the UK, but not only in the UK, my country, in the Netherlands as well. Why did the ministers not think this was an urgent task to address?
You would have to ask them. I mean,
give an answer.
I was hired for this particular job, and for this particular job, you need people with some expertise.
You're almost sounding like a diplomat here, but you are a former journalist, yes. So you can address this question clearly.
Let me guess
yes.
What might be the thinking behind this. The thinking behind this probably is that apart from the current Kremlin, there is no other actor with such a broad, aggressive, wide-range disinformation campaign that is state-organized, that tries to undermine democracies outside of its country. I am not sure if the disinformation you were talking about in UK and Netherlands, I am not sure that organizers of this type of disinformation are actually trying to meddle into the elections in some other countries. My suspicion is that they try to target the domestic audience. What we see from the disinformation campaign, which is orchestrated and awarded by the Kremlin, let me just remind that actually 300 journalists who were lying that there are no Russian troops in Crimea were awarded by President Vladimir Putin. So this disinformation campaign is not only state orchestrated, it is also state awarded. And I'm pretty sure that you would not find such a state actor anywhere in the world.
And what is the impact of the StratCom task force?
You would probably have to ask the people who are consuming our products. I mean, when we were starting in September 2015, the situation was actually quite desperate because we were receiving many questions like, is there really any propaganda, and is it a problem? And maybe it's a problem only in Ukraine, or maybe it's a problem only in Eastern Europe. It seems to me that we are not getting these questions anymore, that now more eyes are opened, and definitely we cannot take the full credit. Definitely we received some help from Vladimir Putin, actually, because the meddling into, for example, the US elections really made more people being interested in this issue, obviously. but yeah, we see that our work does have an impact, and that significant amount of, let's say, government officials are seeking our advice. What is the level of the problem? What is the scale of the problem? How to tackle it?
Last question before I turn to Mathilde. And what do you answer to criticism of those who say, but you're doing the work that journalists should do, and this is state propaganda?
Well, it's not propaganda. We are actually only really posing facts against disinformation. And I mean, it's perfectly okay for you if you want to consume Sputnik. I'm absolutely not against it. But please, let me have the right to say that when Sputnik says that Holodomor was a hoax invented by Western propaganda, that this is actually a lie. If these people have the right to spread a lie, let me please have the right to say that it is a lie. So I would...
Has this really been written?
Yes.
I see.
Please follow our Twitter account and our website, and you will find many examples of these ridiculous claims. So that's like one part. It's not propaganda. The second part is why shouldn't the journalists be doing it? It would be great if the journalists were doing it, but they weren't.
I see. Let's turn to a journalist then. Mathilde Damgé. At Le Monde in 2014, you decided that France needed professional debunking of disinformation. Tell us all about it.
First, I need to say that Libération were the first one, before Le Monde.
Now that is fair.
I have to be honest. We had a blog in 2012 called Les Décodeurs, but we became a proper service only in 2014, as you said. This year we were awarded the Pulitzer along with 400 journalists for the Panama Papers, so I guess that now our work is recognized. We began the Decoder with giving up with one way of doing journalism, which is thinking that you can write the article that sum it all in your little office and then send your article to be printed, and that's it. We think this age is over because you have to be able to be read. I mean, if there's one fact, is that people distrust the media and they don't read the media. So we have to address that. So that's why, formally speaking, we try not to have just one article on every topic, but many ways of approaching a topic, like Facebook Lives, pedagogic articles, data visualization, quiz, some kind of new form that you wouldn't maybe not imagine in Le Monde, but we think we have to be innovative and especially try to speak with the youngest reader. The other thing is that we really think that going on the social media is something you cannot avoid, because we want to argue with the people on the social media. We also want to be able to spot how fake news is spreading. And we want to be challenged. And I think that's something that, well, it's not comfortable. I mean, we don't enjoy being insulted or, being blocked, but that's part of the game. And the social media are also a part of the media. It can be a bit disappointing sometimes to see that the counter fake news, the fact-checking we do are less spread than the fake news itself. I don't have an exact figure, but we tried to estimate some weeks ago. On the social media, fake news would be spread 5 or 6 times more than the work we do. So we know we won't convince everyone, but in a way it's not a problem, because our job is just to be sure that the facts will be somewhere and that people will read them. There are some people who don't like the facts, but they are not our audience or public in a way. What's important is that there are like some people in the middle. I include myself and my grandmother when she sends me some fake news that she received from her neighbor because she didn't check. Sometimes it happens to me. I'm sure it happens to you as well. We are not dishonest, but we don't take the time or we don't have all the tools, and this is a part of the audience we really want to conquer because they have a goodwill, they want to be informed, but some way or the other they can get caught in by a fake news or by a hoax. And that's where our job stands, I think. And we saw, like, well, the French election was obviously a very good example of the work we can do. The press is going through a huge crisis. The industry of the press is going through a crisis, but I'm pretty confident fact-checkers will keep their job because there is so much to do at the moment. What's appalling is that every time you try to prove that some facts are being distorted or that the news is not a news, it's a biased news, or it's just political communication, but which is not honest, you will have one article and a second one and all those kind of new elements I described before. But the political people would keep repeating it because it doesn't matter in a way. We saw it with Marine Le Pen. I'm sorry I have to give this example, but during the debate between the two rounds of the election, she was in front of Emmanuel Macron, and with our colleagues, we noticed more than 20 fake news. Actually, we printed 19 of them, and they were also in the newspaper. That was the first time there was 2 full pages in Le Monde, and it was written the aggressive, like it's wrong. And but we stick to it, and it's just appalling because among all those fake news, there were lots that had been repeated during a year or more. Like she says, you can expulse all the fichier S, people who are surveyed because of radicalization, but it's a way of surveillance, the fiche S. It's not something that tells you that the people is radicalized or is a terrorist, you know. And obviously it's impossible to do that. It's not rational, but she keeps repeating this promise, like, if I'm elected, I'll do that. And it's not only her, it's also emphasized and by all the media who are gonna ask us, that's where it's a bit tricky, show us that it's impossible. If you are saying this is wrong, well, then the responsibility is on you to explain why it's impossible. And that we can do. But when she says, Monsieur Macron, you have an offshore account you didn't talk about, what can we do? We cannot write about that. We have no information. That's her guess. That's what she says. So she's launching a rumor, basically. And then the tricky thing is that we're going to be asked at the media to prove that it's wrong, even if, you know, it doesn't exist. So the proof is on us, in a way.
Mm-hmm. The story exists because it has been spread. And then it's very difficult to get rid of it. Did you also catch Emmanuel Macron on disinformation?
Yeah, actually, he did some approximation. And yeah, we noticed them in an article, but to be honest, there were not a lot to eat. So.
Do you reach out to your audience, to the public? Do you go to to cities to explain what you are doing. Do you work on media literacy, I mean?
On media?
Do you work with schools? Do you go to people?
Yeah.
Do you explain your work?
Yeah, actually we think it's a common responsibility between the media, the social media. They are changing. We could talk about that because it's very interesting. And it's also the responsibility of the reader. So to address this, we have two tools. One we launched some months ago called the Decodex. You can download it from our website. It's a tool that tells you where the news you're reading comes from. If the people who write for this media are journalists, who pays for the website, that kind of information. And the second tool we have is a program called Educator, and we go to schools to try to explain to students how to be careful when they want to be informed.
What is their reaction?
Some of them are pretty clever, and I would say much more than more adults, because they are more used to social media. But it depends on the age and also on the cultural background.
Who is, in your view, most vulnerable to disinformation and fake news? Who is most vulnerable to believe fake news?
People who are so convinced that they wouldn't take the time to think, basically. Like, I mean, it's like, you know, this debate we have in first year in journalism school. Can we be objective? Of course, the short answer is no, we cannot be objective. Nobody is objective, even in science, but we can be honest. But for that, we need to rely on fact, show the sources, be able to have a debate, and all those elements are absent when you have a belief that is so strong that it wouldn't give any room to discussion, to facts, to.
And these people are difficult to reach.
I think they are impossible to reach.
Yeah. It leads us to Ivan Krastev. One of your books, Ivan, bears the title, "In Mistrust We Trust." Can democracy survive when we don't trust our leaders? It will be necessary in this discussion to address this question about the audience and the mistrust that is mounting, as well against journalism, as Mathilde pointed out, as well as to political leaders. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. I do believe it's very important to see what is new and what we should be worried about. Because there's this magic of these words like fake news, post-truth, we have the feeling that we know what we're talking about. It's not always the case. First, there is nothing new about propaganda. Just to remind you an old Cold War joke. There was a competition in Paris, and there were only two teams competing. There was the Americans and the Russians. Americans won. The next day, in the New York Times, the report was, our team won and the Russians was on the last place. And on Pravda was, our team was on the second place and the Americans were the last but one. So from this point of view, interpretation of the political reality is part of politics. So from this point of view, facts are important, but basically pretending that everything can be reduced to fact is just to go and not understanding the basic fact that for different people, different things are true. And this is not new. Secondly, fake news. My grandmother used to call it gossip and rumors. And don't forget, in the time of a war, spreading the rumors was punished by death. So from this point of view, the demoralizing and basically the security impact of spreading rumors is also something that is well known. The third thing which is also well known is that countries try, particularly in a moment of conflicts, to interfere in the domestic politics of other countries. It's enough to read basically the history of the elections, both East and West, in this country in 1947, in Italy in 1949, to know that basically this is also something that is not new. So from my point of view, the most important is to understand what we are really worried about and what we're talking about. And in my view, there's three things that are new and which are important. The first is The governments used to have a privileged access to their citizens. For many reasons, there were not only physical borders, but there were information borders. And part of this information borders was basically based on the language as a natural border, but also on the way of the existing media. From this point of view, there was 2 or 3 televisions. They're very much government control in different countries. What is happening now is that with the big data and with this type of interdependent world, this privileged access to your own citizen is not existing anymore. It is not simply about fake news. It means that on the base of the information that is available coming from the consumptions and others, probably now you can know more about the citizens in other countries. So if you decide to basically intervene and influence them, you have this opportunity. Secondly, we discovered that according to neuroscientists, only 8% of the political decisions are taken on the basis of the rational discussion. We know much, we have a different model how people make decisions. So from this point of view, truth and facts are very much about basically trying to affect the rational part of the human behavior, but emotions mattered a lot. And people basically started to go after the emotions. And from this point of view, this is simply a change of our understanding of politics. I'm saying this because there's a very high level of mistrust, and part of this high level of mistrust in institutions, it's media, it's political institutions, it's political leaders. So all of us have the feeling of a very high level of vulnerability. We should be also very careful what we're calling fake news. To be honest, the hacked emails of Hillary Clinton were not fake news. They were real. The only difference with also real information that came from the Panama paper is that nobody is taking responsibility for leaking them. And here comes the story. I find 3 security dimensions, and I do believe this is going to be the challenge for people like you that were trying to regulate and to basically diminish the risk of a conflict. Unlike with the nuclear weapons, where basically there is no deniability. You know where it comes, and there are very few actors that can do it. With all this type of a cyber attack and basically supply of a fake news and information, you have a very high level of deniability. It's very difficult really to prove. Who did it, how did it? Secondly, even if you can prove it, comes the time factor. One of the major changes in the media environment is that people are interested in a certain issue not more than 72 hours. So, for example, when it comes to the chemical attack in Syria, the first 72 hours matters. If in 7 months you're going to come with a much more detailed information than others, nobody. It's not going to have a political effect. And this level of deniability and this level of the time factor comes with the third thing, which is going to make a huge problem, this type of a new vulnerability coming from misinformation, coming from cyber and others. And this is the new role of the non-state actors. It is not easy, and it's going to be even more difficult to distinguish, even when you know from where the attack comes. Is it a state or non-state actor? And from this point of view, one of the biggest problems is overreaction. This is a different with propaganda. Propaganda, listen, Sputnik. You can basically say they're wrong, you know who is saying this, and from this point of view, it's not a major issue because it's about the credibility of the source of information. But when you have a spread of information or when you have a cyber attack and you do not know who is doing this, and you can only suspect, is it a non-state actor or it's a non-state actor hired by a government, then your reaction is very difficult to be taken. And I do believe this is the major regulation issue which is going to come to people like you, that institutionally should reduce the risks of all this. And for me, this is the real problem. Let's be honest, the problem of mistrust in our societies are not the results of acts of the external powers. External powers can instrumentalize this mistrust for their geopolitical interests, and they're doing this. The mistrust is very much connected with the way the market works, the culture work, basically. And from this point of view, to try to explain everything which is happening on the level of mistrust, just basically externalizing it, could be also a mistake. And I'm going to give you one example. One of the best things that you can read about this story of new culture of mistrust is a book called The Merchants of Doubt. And this was how the tobacco companies have been fighting against the scientific information coming about the health effect, negative health effect of tobacco. And they were not lying. It was not fake. But they're using the fact that the science is never can claim anything with 100% certainty. They're always 95%, 96%. And there was a huge funding of research which is just showing that this is not 100%. And now you mistrust and you cannot verify. And this is this absence of the verifying instruments, which in my view are going to be the major security challenge for the public like yours.
This mistrust, yeah? Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, it's not a question, but just to correct, we know John Doe, the source of the Panama Papers. He's known by the Obermeier from Süddeutsche Zeitung.
Yeah, my idea was this is the difference between email of Hillary Clinton, where
Mathilde,
basically
you
nobody takes the public responsibility for the information that was leaked.
And you were part of it, Mathilde, of the Panama Papers team.
Yeah, so, and I do believe this is the major problem, how you are going to trust, and this is where the people stop to be interested in the source of information. Because there were rumors and fake news and bullshit always. But in a certain way, because when there was a much higher levels of trust in the authorities, in media and others, the question was, who is saying this? We go in a situation in which people trust much more the people next to them. They're less trustful in the institutions.
But then the question is, if you address fake news and you debunk disinformation, are you addressing the right issue?
Is there a way in which we're trying to control and influence the information in an open space, or we're trying to basically try to recreate the information borders in the way they were? And I don't believe it's going to be very successful, honestly speaking. It's not going to be very successful because now, imagine that in 10 years, your telephones are going to be your personal interpreters. They're going to translate from any language that they talk. From this point of view, to try to believe that they can be a total control over the media space. And one of the reasons people are so mistrustful is that they're living in the world about, they don't have enough experience. Imagine 100 years ago, you have a personal experience about many things that are reported and talked. And now there are many things that you cannot have an opinion. I have been doing a lot on the opinion polls. Do you know what? People, let's give you a Russian example. When it comes to the economy, and when it comes to basically the state of the economy, Russian public, according to the Levada surveys, does not trust their government because they have a personal experience, I mean, not the government, but the official propaganda coming from the government, because they have a personal experience and they know what is happening in the shops. When it comes to Syria, of course, they trust the government because they don't have this type of experience. I'm saying this because I do believe we can create a situation in which we're going to allow the government to go after everything that they don't like. It could be in opposition parties, you can damn them populist, far right, far left, and so on. And this is a trade-off that should be talked seriously because it's easy to be case. Ukraine is a country in a war. I can imagine why people are doing this or that, but where is the line and who is putting the line? Is it the national government who decides what is a threat to national security?
Yes, but if, as you say, censorship leads to more censorship and is thus not a solution, if I translate you well, what should be done then?
Listen, there was an old story and always was. There is no government in the world, nevertheless how democratic, that likes to be criticized and basically to come with information and so on. But you should try to create a media space in which you're fighting with this news. Because the news story is going to be more and more difficult to cut different sources of information because the problem with the social media is exactly That you can have a site which is going to be created immediately today, you're going to close it in 3 months, it's going to appear a different site, that if this is doing the same type of an information. And I do believe that there should be a much more stronger public debate and much more debate about what is going on in the world than simply believing that you can isolate them through banning this or that. There's some cases in which you can go, but in my view, this should be an ultimate. This should be the nuclear option and not the everyday option in which the governments are jumping on.
In this era, it's too late for censorship. Mathilde, what's your recipe? I suppose it's not censorship.
No, actually I'm a bit frightened sometimes, but things I can hear. No, I don't think we should ban some newspapers or TV or even our blogs, or even if we don't believe what the news they spread. I think it would be counterproductive to do that and very dangerous. I think we should keep a very, very strong appetite for discussion, and for that the social media are a very good example of how it can bring us the best and the worst. The best is that you are able to argue with people all over the planet about any topic with a freedom of speech that's pretty amazing. Of course, there's a law, and the law is well done. You know, defamation is punished, anti-Semitism is, well, there are some barriers already, and they're fine. But you can still have some pretty large discussion with people you maybe have never met. The worst is that the social media are based on something that is as ancient as rumor. It's emotion. They promote, I don't know how to translate that, l'engagement. It's, you know, when you share or when you like.
Commitment.
Yes, exactly. And when you do that, the news or the element is going up in their algorithm. And of course, if you see something that makes you angry or that makes you very happy or gonna provoke a reaction, and as a human being, you're gonna like it very much or comment it or share it. And they are changing, and I think it's very important because we can have a serene debate only if, of course we have emotion, but it has to be assorted with facts and with common sense. I mean, it's just as basic as that. And just keep reading as many newspapers and watch as many TV as you can. That's the best advice we can give, I think.
Inform yourself, yes.
And inform yourself on the media itself. That's
right. So media literacy as a primary medicine against disinformation.
Yeah. Who pays for it is a very, very important information. We used to say follow the money. That's a good information, I think.
Good. Among the audience, we have Nadia Arbatova, who raised her hand a century ago. Wanted to speak right from the beginning of this debate. Please, you have the floor, but you need a microphone. Perhaps push a button.
Thank you. I have a very short comment and a very short question. The comment is on minority. The Western democracy is about protection of minority from abuse of majority. Yes. And in my view, it's not only Russia's fault that some Russian minorities are gravitating towards Russia, but I think it is also fault by those who lost a golden opportunity to make of this minority the most loyal citizens. That is my comment. My question is, if Mr. Putin, Kremlin, the Russian establishment at large are so unpopular in your societies, if you know by definition that Russia's information is misinformation, why are you so concerned about RTI, about Sputnik? Why all this fuss about very marginal media mass sources?
This asks for a reaction first from the StratCom task force, I think. because you address precisely these media, why bother so much? And your point, of course, on making a minority into the most loyal citizens you can get is as valid as you can get them. Huh? One of the biggest failures of the last decades in Europe, the social cohesion. Yes.
Well, the reason is, oh, that's very loud. The reason is actually pretty simple. It's the Russian official documents like the military doctrine, like the security doctrine, the documents like the Gerasimov doctrine, describing how the Kremlin, using the information influence, tries to undermine our democracies. And yeah, that's basically the reason why we focus on them so much. And we see that the Russian media...
So I don't think you can be heard without a microphone, I'm afraid.
And we actually see that the pro-Kremlin outlets are following these official documents, and they are lying about no Russian troops in Crimea. They are lying about crazy, gay, Nazi, Ukrainian monsters shot down MH17, basically everybody else apart from the Russian book, right?
Yes.
So yeah, we see them performing these tasks.
Just one word.
Just one word and then your neighbor.
Yes, if you know that they are lying, why are you so concerned about the impact of Sputnik and RTA? That is my question.
Because they have an impact.
Just 1 second. Your comment is pertinent and your question is awesome. For pragmatic reasons. Because I have the uttermost admiration for this cyber communication that Kremlin has done in the past 5 years. I can admire even my adversaries, if I might say so. So it's for pragmatic reasons. Like Russian government is defending their interests, the way they view what's best for their countries. That's the same reason why we, especially in Eastern Europe, have this adversity towards Russia, not because it's personal, but because it's historical and with a lot of things like that. But me, as a media, as a journalist and social media expert, I honestly admire it. It was done excellent. So this is why Brussels is afraid.
François Hesbourg.
Yeah, Istvan, earlier on you compared nuclear weapons and the info and cyber sphere, saying that there was a basic difference, and that is the difficulty of attribution. And I agree with that. But there are two other big differences which are correlated. One is that nuclear weapons are made not to be used, and they are quite good at that, actually. Whereas info and cyber ops are made to be used. And the third difference is that their use does not produce the same effects as the use of nuclear weapons. Now, if I combine these three things, you have some very severe security implications because non-attribution cuts both ways. Yes, it's difficult to prove that, for example, what happened on the evening of the second round of the French election was a direct and specific GRU operation. It's very difficult to prove. But there are a lot of footprints all over the place. Will the response be public? Or will the response be in kind? And if it is in kind, vis-à-vis what will it be? And given the speed at which these things happen, there is a big premium to preempt. So this is a recipe for instability, destabilization, maximum mutual inconvenience. And this is something which maybe the perpetrators of these new kind of operations did not fully realize when they started to enter into them, whether it is the Russians in Estonia in 2005, or whether it's the Americans and the Israelis with Stuxnet against Iran. this is a whole new ballgame. And I echo your question, Nadia. Since the effects are not those of nuclear weapons, and since the inconvenience to the perpetrator can be so high, there indeed is a legitimate question as to whether we should treat this as a first-order challenge or deserving radical solutions like eliminating our own freedoms and destroying globalization in the process, by the way, which is something the populists dearly want, or whether this should be dealt with a mixture of practical stuff, like the sort of things that the EEAS does, and I like what you do, by the way, but also not to get too hot under the collar. When I look at the info ops launched by Sputnik against Macron, when I look at the cyber ops which were launched against Macron, people are now so used to this sort of stuff that oh yeah, it's the Russians again. Oh yeah, and by the way, Macron did not have any set views about Russia a year ago, but he certainly has very set views today about Russia, and they're not very nice, to put it mildly. So let's simply use the old recipe. Sunlight is the best antiseptic. Censorship is not. A last point, youth. Marine Le Pen and Monsieur Mélenchon had the youngest electorates. All of the oldies voted for the moderate parties of the right and of the left. The Nazis were not old and the Bolsheviks were not old. Believe me, youth is a disease from which one is rapidly cured, but it can be quite lethal while it lasts.
Yes.
Well,
this is rejoicing. No, sorry. I take the floor. It's rejoicing that we get used to and we learn how to cope with disinformation, contrary, of course, to the use of nuclear weapons. I would like to I'll come to you later, but Katerina, you have the floor. Katarina Krivankova.
Thank you for a word. I'm here in the name of the project OSCE Info, which is a student project who tries to encourage critical thinking and increase some media literacy among Czech youth, especially from 15 to 19 years old. And the youth is particularly targeted by the disinformation waves, and we aim to teach young people how to recognize and counter to the hateful fueling propaganda. Thus, we challenge the extremism in their own origins. And we are trying to do this by 5 easy steps. And its toolkit teach young people how to identify disinformation, illustrating the most common some manipulative technique, and we providing tips how to works, for example, with some trolls on the internet, etc. And we are trying to do so in the objective way. We can put finger on pro-Kremlin propaganda because they wouldn't listen us. And I would like to ask speakers if my first question is if there are some other project bottom up this problem from the common people like students or etc. And if there is some chance how to take step to the rationality and how to return trust in a democracy, if there is any chance.
But first, now that you're here, you were a political science student, and
yes.
you started this project on fake news, disinformation, and raising awareness among the youngest generation students and high school students. And what is your concrete experience? What happens when you deal with this, when you discuss this subject?
Students doesn't care at all about the political situation.
Well, that's encouraging.
Yeah.
No, but what does that mean? They don't
Sad
care
but
because
true,
they understand that
but
this is disinformation, or they don't care because they don't care?
Half and half, I think. The half who was interested in politics started to be tired and apathetic, and second, just have another issues to be interested in. So, and we are trying to focus in this young generation because they don't have any automatic filter how to get information. So we are trying to get some toolkit how to recognize where it's true or not, or at least I.
But she's a great example, like my colleagues from the 1989 Generation Initiative in London, you said to mention something similar. It's a bit wider. We are trying to make policy proposals, pro bono, to propose them in Brussels in October. This year's theme is tackling populism, and we are divided among different roundtables. So she's a good example, and I'm sure all across Europe we can find young people with initiative. I want to address a question. Yes, of course, Your Excellency, I'm aware that revolutions start from young people. But in the case of France, Marine Le Pen did not win. What about in the case of Brexit, when the young people, the ones under 25, did not go to the polls? They were the last ones, I mean, the last segment to vote. So of course, but doesn't this tell us something, that different situations need different approaches? So
I have at least Ivan and Jakub who want to say something.
I just want to make 2 points. One is that we should be very careful. We try to put in one thing and one basically package everything that we don't like in the world. Populist parties, misinformation, and so on. People have the right to see the world differently than we do it. If we continue basically punishing people for this, this is one of the major sources of the populist vote. The second thing,
yes,
and it's very much what Francois was saying. Listen, for me, there is a problem, security impact, but this is also because of the lack of experience. This starts to happen, particularly with the cyber, very early on. And people are going to decide how it works. Honestly speaking, I don't believe that the Russian side, you have very much gained any influence out of hacking of the Hillary Clinton story. First, basically, this totally paralyzed, and if Donald Trump had any intention to do something with Russia, now it became so much a political issue, it cannot work. Secondly, on the Macron story, I don't know who did it. The first suspect is going to be the Russian Federation. I'm saying this because when this thing starts to happen, people are starting to reconsider. But here's my kind of a fear, which is much more real. Imagine for a while that you are a young American in Silicon Valley, very talented in this field, and you're reading in the papers that the president that you don't like much, you didn't vote it for, was elected because of the hacking capacity of a foreign power. Are you not going to be tempted to do something to the Russians? And how the Russians are going to know that this is a Silicon Valley kid and not the CIA? This is the real problem, and I do believe this is the problem that should be addressed in an organization like this, that should be about prevention and type of a risk that we're talking about. This is the real problem.
It is a problem. Jakub, please, short, because I really want to address the 2 questions over there.
Yeah, 2 sharp points. About other projects, let's talk after the panel. About this young versus old, please, let's not make general conclusions based on particular cases. We have debunked over 3,000 pieces of disinformation. I can honestly tell you that there will not be many people in this room that have seen more of pro-Kremlin disinformation than I have. And I know very well that the disinformation is very well orchestrated. It knows our audiences much better than we know them. I am absolutely sure about that. They know to address generation 50 plus, they know how to address generation under 20, they know how to address people who do not visit news sites, they know how to address people who don't have social media accounts, they know to address people who do have social media accounts. I mean, there are channels of spreading disinformation that you even do not know about. For example, my father sometimes forwards me these incredibly long email chains which basically contain just copy-pasted disinformation articles from some of the outlets. This is an incredibly important tool for generation 50 plus. It's not public. So please, let's just not make general conclusions on singular events.
Yeah, I received this kind of chain mails when I was an MEP. You have the floor, please. Sir. Let's keep it short because there are more questions. Our Armenian colleague as well.
I wanted to offer 2 points for consideration on the policy front, one negative and the other positive. I think that although I agree with Ivan that attribution is very difficult, it is eventually possible. And there's nothing against punitive action once it is identified, and I think it's necessary in this case. And then there's also creative forms of preemption. If you look at how bad the Democratic National Committee was without password protection and such, and how good Macron was creatively putting out fake emails of his own, there's already a leap in understanding there, and I think that can be developed much further. But since this is the OSCE and has a kind of positive cooperative spirit, one should at least be trying with Russia to develop certain norms of international cyber conduct in the spirit of Helsinki, of course. It doesn't stand great chances of success at the moment, but there's no reason not to try, and I see almost no effort on that front coming from any direction, and that's itself curious. So I think that one can be sort of tough and diplomatic simultaneously, and that might be the best way of making policy progress.
I'm extremely sorry, I didn't hear you very well. But your last point, very shortly.
I think one can be tough and diplomatically creative simultaneously. Take preemptive and punitive measures while at the same time exploring with Russia, with China, with powers that do this kind of interference, what might be a better, or what might be a international system of cyber norms, because none exists at the moment.
Norms, yes. Codes of conduct. Yes. Right, thank you. Please.
Okay,
and excuse me, who are you and why?
Michael Kimmich, professor at Catholic University.
Thank you.
And I'm Reinhard Krumm from the Ebert Foundation. I would like to support Ivan Krastev in terms of what kind of information we get. When I was a student, the professor said, always read the other side. This is much more interesting than your own side.
Did you do law?
Excuse me?
Did you do law?
No, I didn't do law. I did history, but it's the same. And I think more and more we see that a certain amount of people more and more read what they like to read. And it's extremely difficult to have arguments getting away from the argument. And you don't see this only in Russia. As much as I appreciate your work, but it's interesting, you say you address decision makers, experts, but you're afraid, and not you, but the EU clearly, who did give you the job, they're more afraid that the Russian media outlet as Russia Today and others influence the people. You're not getting towards the people because they are partly even convinced, and the experts don't get to the people. So I don't quite still, if I read your work, and I do this every week, I still don't get really what this is good for. And I agree with this Mr. Abatov. I think Russia Today and Sputnik is completely overrated. Completely.
Don't tell them. They would be disappointed. We'll come to reactions after the round of questions, yes? Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, sir. Thanks to the distinguished speakers. We were referring to the post-truth politics. I would be interested to know, one should presume that there was a period of truth politics. I would be interested to know when was that happy period of humankind. And second,
it's a nasty question.
I have one, maybe it may sound naive, but I just recalled another story of countering propaganda. It was during the Second World War, Nazi soldiers were near Stalingrad, and a German-speaking Russian officer was proposed to lead counter-propaganda against Goebbels' propaganda. And he was offered to read by radio a statement which was all about how crazy is Hitler and so on and so forth. He said German soldiers will not buy that. They have reached the center of Russia. They will never buy that. Their leader is crazy. And he was asked then, what do you propose us to read? He said, read Goethe, read Schiller, remind the German soldiers of the positive side of their nation, their culture, their philosophy. So I think that the narrative to propaganda should be outlining, raising awareness about nations, about each other, and raising awareness about positive sides, about culture, philosophy of the nations. This may sound naive, this may sound disproportionate somehow, but I think this is the long-term solution. Thank you very much.
This calls for a long discussion. I refrain myself, but it's a very, very good point. Let's read more Goethe. And I'm not kidding. Reading literature and poetry is essential for your ability to critically assess your own culture. Please, sir.
Charles Ross, European Anti-Corruption Center. I'd like to
Once
thank
again, sorry?
Charles Ross, the European Anti-Corruption Center. I'd like to thank the OSCE and the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs for hosting this very important colloquium. I would like to ask, please, to broaden the discussion of our distinguished panelists in reminding people that the problems we are discussing are in fact not new. If we look at the second section, the typically unread section of the Yeltsin Strategic Doctrine, we will find a roadmap for the kinds of activities we are discussing tonight. Similarly, we have a tendency to think of everything as either the manipulation of public opinion or a potential Article 5 violation. There are shades of difference in between. And I think that we need to address the issue actively, that in certain cases, for example, we see Ukrainian soldiers in the trenches of the Donbass receiving SMS messages on Russian-owned mobile networks that say, it's all right, they will find your body in the spring when the snows melt. I would appreciate your thoughts on the broader aspects, because in fact it's not enough to simply look, in my opinion, at the slight manipulations of election results, the tendency of more and more citizens to choose platforms where they can actively select the kinds of news from the kinds of sources that they appreciate, and the potential for voluntary, perhaps miseducation, and a lack of breadth in understanding what is actually happening. These are issues that, in fact, go beyond regulatory. They're, in fact, educational in some respects. And I would appreciate your thoughts. Thank you.
Any more questions here? Yes, sir.
Just more or less in the same line. I'm a Lithuanian permanent representative for the OSCE in Vienna. More or less in the same line. I remember Forum 2000 conference some 3 years ago here in Prague, and one of the panelists was Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And I asked him a question, where Russian Democrats have disappeared? Because in the perestroika times and during our democratic revolutions in Baltic countries times, they were our best supporters and our best friends. We had a lot of contacts with them and a very good interaction. And now we do not see them on the Russian scene. And Khodorkovsky's answer was, you know, for Goebbels it was enough 3-4 years to brainwash such a country as such a nation as German nation was. And here you have this very targeted propaganda for 14 years. The conference took place in 2014. So it was his answer, and just taking more on this. There is a big difference where the people get such a fake news as a crucified boy in the eastern Ukraine. So perhaps this news might reach even those students they were referred to who do not care with such piece of news. But of course, the response from you, from StratCom, perhaps it won't reach. It won't be such colorful as it is this fake news about this crucified boy. So how to reach those people, of course, not only those Democrats who disappeared in Russia, but also many people here in our societies and those students who do not care. I'm not so sure whether really those news whom I read and whom I find very, very useful, but unfortunately they do not reach many of the audiences.
Yes, thank you very much. We're not able to address more questions. We need to wrap this up. And it's time for famous last words of those four distinguished panelists.
I've heard that you all like to quote history, and I agree with you. Rumor has always existed, and history is most of the time written by the winners. But we really have to be aware, I think, of the importance of the social media, because the old rumor is getting obese. It's feeding itself with globalization. And do you know any young people who doesn't have a Facebook or Twitter or an Instagram account? And that makes it all different, because it's not only people close to you who will influence your judgment and your emotion, it's the whole world that's basically playing with your brain and with the time that you could use to be informed. So there are some interesting moves at the moment. The German wants to have a law if Facebook is spreading false information. That's the first step. There is a parliamentary inquiry in the UK. There are lots of steps that are being taken at the moment. And we at the media, we keep doing our job, whether it's heard or read or spread. Doesn't depend only on us, but I think it's part of the game. And there are the government, there are the media, but I really do think the last part is you. It's the people have to be aware now that they are responsible of the information they spread. And that's about education.
Thank you, Mathilde. Ivan.
Listen, there was a classical question: are democracies much more vulnerable than authoritarian regime because of their open nature? And this is the question that we are facing. I don't believe that we are going to do better if we try to imagine that we are going to basically save our democracies, basically trying to imitate policies coming from authoritarian regimes. So from this point of view, I personally believe that securitizing certain type of the misinformation makes sense, because of the level of interdependence and vulnerability. But here it's very important to keep the line. And I very much agree with the American colleague. This organization was about common norms. If we believe that in this type of a cyber insecurity that is coming, there is a shared risk for being vulnerable, shared risk for overreacting. I do believe that there should be an attempt to come at least with an effort to regulate and come with a certain type of norms. And also I agree that, of course, the deniability is much easier than with the nuclear power, but it does not mean that you cannot prove where basically the attack come from. Because otherwise we can go either in one dimension, basically saying we're going to solve the problem with mistrust in societies when we're not going to allow the people to get any information that we don't like. I don't believe it's going to work.
Thank you, Ivan. Diana.
I was helped a little bit because I will answer His Excellency's question. My solution is get outside the bubble. We here live in a bubble. We follow disinformation review because we need it in our work, different works from policymaking to journalistic assessment. So I know it's very hard to understand those who are victims of fake news, of the post-truth world. Many times they are very smart people. I have my own cases even in my circle of friends, even my age. And it's hard for me to understand where did we go on separate paths in this area. But it's very important to address their fears and their needs. And this is, I think this is an information war. This is a cyber war, okay? So we should fight probably with the same weapons. We complain on a daily basis about populists and how they reach people with their catchy news, but this is the reality now. If none of you who can make a change, because I am too on a lower level, so I cannot influence it so much. If none of you understands this new reality and address the fears, the needs, nothing's going to change. And I will end very quickly by quoting Robert Kaplan, which is a great American journalist and analyst, and he said something very wise, and I share his words. It's much easier to be a journalist and an analyst than a policymaker or a politician. So my respect to all of you. I hope you will make the wisest decision.
I was a journalist and I was a politician. I confirm. Please, Jakub, last.
How to reach further audiences? Well, we need more channels, we need more multipliers, we need more speakers. I mean, please don't expect that 2 people in Brussels will address 650 million people in Europe. They won't. I can tell you honestly, they won't. And that's also actually part of the answer to your question. We are trying to address politicians, government officials, journalists, when we see that the interest from them is on the rise, and I can tell you that the interest in September 2015 was almost at 0, and now it's somewhere at 90%. So I'm actually quite satisfied that we reached the result we sort of targeted for. About the impact of Russia today, we are not talking about only one channel, really. We have thousands and thousands of channels. There are something like 40 disinformation websites in Czech Republic, 40 of them in Slovakia, around 100 of them in Hungary. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of social media trolls multiplying the very same pieces of disinformation. And I would really like to see actually the piece of data, some piece of facts. Why would you think that this disinformation campaign doesn't have any influence? Because the opinion polls we have, and they are public, that actually measure how pro-Kremlin disinformation is accepted and received, how many people buy it, how many people believe it, are extremely worrying. The 2015 Pew poll said that 50% of France believes that Ukraine is to blame for the war in Ukraine. It's an obvious nonsense. Whose tanks are on whose territory? It's a lie multiplied just by the pro-Kremlin disinformation machine. But you have a 50% of one significant country believing an obvious nonsense. The opinion poll that was conducted here in Czech Republic, in Hungary and Slovakia told us that something like 20 to 40% of people believe various disinformation narratives about Russia fighting exclusively ISIS in Syria, not bombing any civilians. These are all lies that are not spread by journalists, I mean the real journalists. They are spread just by the disinformation machine. And we see a significant part of our populations buying these pieces of disinformation. So it has an impact.
Thank you very much, Jakub. And with this, we come to a close of this small debate where we did not answer all questions, but where we concluded that we will go towards truth politics, which is a nice future to be looking forward to, where we concluded that we need common norms about how to behave in the virtual reality, spreading information or not, and I'm afraid it will be a very difficult thing to convince everybody on this. And I thank you very much, Ivan Krastev, Mathilde Damgé, Jakub Kalenský, Diana Rusu, for your efforts here to enlighten us on the issue. And I thank you very much for your very kind attendance.